Hello and welcome to this SIRS 2020 virtual symposium, Learning Under Uncertainty in Different Stages of Psychosis. My name is Graham Murray from Cambridge, and I'm delighted to introduce you to this symposium that was organized by Dr. Franziska Knolle and Dr. Kelly Diederen, who we'll hear from. Now, I do need to tell you about a change in the advertised program, as our first talk unfortunately had to be cancelled when the symposium went virtual due to a timetable clash. However, if you are interested in Katarina Wellstein's very interesting work, then I'd encourage you to have a look at her published paper in schizophrenia research from earlier this year, where you can get more details. And I'm pleased to say we still do have talks from some very talented early career researchers, Dr. Franziska Knolle from Technical University Munich, Dr. Teresa Katthagen from Charité Berlin, and Dr. Kelly Diederen, who has recently taken up a position as a group leader, directing her own group at King's College London. So why the topic of learning under uncertainty? Well, sensory input into the brain is often noisy and ambiguous, and its source is only indirectly accessible. And therefore, according to the predictive processing framework, the brain generates a model of the world to form predictions and prepare for upcoming events. And the model is formed through associations and updated based on prediction error minimization techniques. Now, recent theories of psychosis suggest that it is learning from prediction errors under the uncertainty of a volatile environment that's disturbed in psychosis and could ultimately lead to the formation of delusions and hallucinations. Now, in this symposium, we bring together a variety of experimental methods such as behavioral work, computational modeling, functional imaging, molecular imaging, and pharmacological intervention to investigate these recent theories experimentally and to explore whether learning under uncertain probabilistic circumstances is suboptimal in individuals at different stages of psychotic illness. Taken together, the symposium provides evidence that in early psychosis there is impaired learning from prediction errors under uncertainty, and the symposium provides insight into brain signaling of prediction errors in psychosis and its relation to dopaminergic neurochemistry. Thank you very much for joining us for the virtual symposium.
Good morning, afternoon, or good evening. I would like to welcome everyone who's watching this talk, and I would like to thank Franziska Knolle for organizing the symposium and the other participants for helping to bring the symposium together. I'm Kelly Diederen, and I'm interested in how alterations in learning and decision-making under uncertainty relate to psychosis. I'm going to talk about two studies. In these studies, we investigated whether early psychosis and dopaminergic perturbation are associated with alterations in learning from uncertain or imprecise outcomes. To give a bit of background, learning to accurately predict future outcomes is essential for decision-making, so for picking the best options in our day-to-day life. And in order to learn, what we do is that we compare the predictions that we had to novel information that we receive, and we see whether these two sources match. So if the two sources match, so we got what we expected, then nothing is to be learned. However, if these two sources do not match, then a discrepancy signal is generated, which is called a prediction error. And this prediction error tells us that there is something to learn and that we should update our predictions. To start with an illustrative or simple example, I experienced a very big prediction error when unexpectedly our symposium was selected for presentation at SIRS. And I was extremely happy about that. But due to that, I expected to be attending SIRS in person, as I'm sure all of you were, and to give a talk at the conference. However, then there was a novel observation, namely the coronavirus outbreak in Italy in March. And this completely violated my expectation of going to SIRS in person, meaning that I experienced a very big prediction error. And that prediction error meant that I had to update my expectation and to instead predict that I would no longer attend SIRS, which unfortunately turned out to be correct. But luckily, we have this online symposium. Although in general prediction errors indicate that there's something to learn, it is important to note that not all prediction errors are equally informative. And this is because both the predictions that we have and the novel information that we receive each have an associated precision, which reflects how reliable or certain we can be about that source of information. If either or both of these sources are uncertain, this can lead to an uncertain or imprecise prediction errors, which should mean that there is not really very much to learn. So to give you an example, in the case of the pandemic outbreak in Italy, we knew that this was a very precise or reliable observation, so we could safely update our prediction. However, now imagine a toy example where you would see a ghost-like figure in the dark. And you have to judge whether to update your prediction to believe that ghosts exist, or whether you should not really rely on that observation, as it might be a very imprecise one, as it was dark, so we cannot see very well. So in this toy example case of the ghost, we would indeed not update our prediction. And what this means is that in general, if prediction errors are less precise, we should largely ignore them, which means that little or nothing is to be learned. So what we need then is a mechanism to include the level of precision into our learning. So what we can do is we can weight our prediction errors relative to their precision to determine how much should be learned. In recent years, several people have proposed that psychosis ultimately results from an inability to adapt to uncertainty in the environment and to learn in situations that are uncertain or imprecise. Specifically, it has been hypothesized that impaired precision rating of prediction errors, as I introduced in the previous slide, may be part of the cascade that results in psychotic symptoms. And the same theorists have proposed that neuromodulator systems, in specific dopamine, play an important role in mediating the precision of prediction errors, although support for this hypothesis is limited. And the reason I say that support for the hypothesis of dopamine playing a role in precision rating of prediction errors is limited is because these theories look at the absolute prediction error or the unsigned prediction error. So they look at the size of the prediction error itself, independent of whether it is positively valence or negatively valence. And most studies to date who have looked at prediction errors have looked at the so-called reward prediction errors, which takes the valence of the prediction error into account. So even though there's increased interest in the possibility that psychosis might result from inability to deal with uncertainty in the environment or to learn in uncertain situations, there are to date no studies that provide direct evidence for this hypothesis. And even though several neuroimaging studies have indicated abnormal brain prediction error signals in schizophrenia and related psychosis, none of these studies have actually addressed precision rating of prediction errors in patients. So here we studied whether and how precision rating of unsigned prediction error signals is disrupted in psychosis. And as a reminder, what I mean with unsigned prediction errors is the size of the prediction error independent of whether it is a better outcome than expected or a worse outcome than expected. And this is something novel about the theories I talked about previously, which means that there is little evidence for these theories. So as the precision rating of unsigned prediction error signals has previously been largely speculative, we first tested whether unsigned prediction errors are indeed coded relative to their associated precision in the cortex of healthy individuals, and whether also in healthy individuals, dopamine modulates the precision of these prediction error signals. We used a task where people had to iteratively update their predictions based on the outcomes that they had received. So people were showed a cue, which indicated whether an outcome came from a distribution with low, medium, or large precision. Then they were asked to indicate their prediction, and after a short delay, they were shown the actual outcome, which led to a prediction error. and they could use this prediction error to update their learning. And the outcomes were drawn from these distributions. So precision was manipulated using different standard deviations. And although the cues indicated the relative level of precision, participants were not told about the exact level of precision, so they had to learn that. So using this design, participants were encountered to compare their prediction errors relative to the precision of the condition, as indicated by the cue, and as they would experience by more fluctuation in outcomes and more imprecise conditions. And it also allowed us, this design, to elicit direct measures of prediction error, as the magnitude of the prediction error is directly observable, rather than inferring it as a latent variable, as is common in many other studies. To first study the encoding of unsigned prediction errors relative to their precision in the healthy brain, and to test for the effects of dopamine, we gave 3 groups of participants either dopaminergic medication or placebo. And the people who got dopaminergic medication received sulpiride, a dopamine antagonist, or bromocriptine, a dopamine agonist. And shortly after receiving the drugs, people were asked to undergo an fMRI session while they performed the task that I presented in the previous slide. To investigate the effect of precision, we first look at performance. And please note here that a higher level means that you perform worse rather than better. And this is because the best you can do in this task is to predict the mean of the outcome distribution. And this is, of course, harder if there is less precision. So the higher bars for the low levels of precision mean that overall people performed better when there was high precision. But what we can also see is that overall the sulpiride group performed much worse, or significantly worse, I should say, than the placebo group. So showing an initial effect of sulpiride on behavior. So next we looked at the MRI results, and in these MRI results we used the unsigned prediction error, or the prediction error magnitude, as a parametric regressor at the time of outcome in the task. So just to recap, the unsigned prediction error means that the magnitude of the prediction error matters, but it doesn't matter whether the prediction error is positive here or whether it is negative, which is key to these theories about people with psychosis having problems dealing with lack of precision in the environment. And doing this analysis allowed us to, first of all, explore where unsigned prediction errors were coded in the brain, and subsequently define regions of interest for subsequent analysis that would focus on the effect of dopamine on the precision rating of these prediction errors. And what you can see in this figure is that we found significant effects of unsigned prediction error coding in the superior frontal cortex and in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. And all of these effects were significant at the whole brain level. So based on these previous findings, we used the left and right superior frontal cortex and the dorsal anterior cingulate clusters as regions of interest to take forward for our analysis of dopaminergic effects on precision rating. So in the left superior frontal cortex, there was significant interaction across precision conditions and the medication group, where less precision rating occurred, as you can see here, in the sulpiride group compared to the placebo group. So what is indicated here is that you pay more attention or weigh the prediction error more when it's in a high precision condition compared to a low precision condition. And you can see that this did not happen in the sulpiride group. So we found a similar effect in the right superior frontal cortex. However, this effect was not significant. But overall, the pattern is the same. We also found a similar effect in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. So again, where precision rating was significantly different in the sulpiride group compared to the placebo group. And here the effect was trend level significant. The final thing we wanted to test is whether there would be any relationship between performance on the task and the extent of precision weighting of prediction errors. And this is important as accurately estimating the precision of prediction errors and taking into account during learning should improve learning and hence result in better task performance. So when we look at this figure, we can see that across these three groups, that as precision weighting increased, the inverse performance decreased. So this means that with a higher level of precision weighting, people actually had better performance. And this was both observed in the left superior frontal cortex and in the right superior frontal cortex. So as an interim conclusion, we found that the superior frontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex code unsigned prediction errors relative to their precision. We also found that sulpiride perturbs this process and that there is a relationship between precision weighting at the level of the brain and how well people perform on the. Next, we wanted to examine how individual differences in brain precision weighting signals related to clinical psychosis on the one hand and psychotic-like thinking in healthy individuals on the other hand. So first, we examined the relationship between scores on the schizotypal personality questionnaire and precision weighting of prediction error in healthy individuals. These individuals are free from the possible confounds of medication and don't have any illness duration effects. So for this, we pulled the participants from the dopamine study that I just described, in addition to an additional sample from a previous study. And then subsequently, we studied precision weighting of prediction errors in two clinical samples. One was people with first episode psychosis and the other people at risk of psychosis. We found that in general, people who scored higher on the schizotypal personality questionnaire had a lower level of precision weighting in this area in the right superior frontal cortex. And although it's not shown here, we also found that people who scored higher on the SPQ were performing less well on the task. For the clinical study, we recruited people with the first episode of psychosis and people with a so-called at-risk mental state who are at risk of psychosis. And in addition, we recruited 30 healthy controls. So you can see the details of the groups here. And all of these participants performed a very similar task to the one I described before while they were in the scanner. But to limit the scanning time, we made the task a bit shorter. And this was done by removing the medium precision condition and only keeping the low precision and the high precision conditions. The first thing that we found was that performance again was better when the precision was high, similar to our previous studies and very logical. And please remember that, as I mentioned before, that a higher bar here actually means you're performing less well. And in addition to this effect, which is more interesting, is that we found that people with first episode psychosis, but not people with an at-risk mental state, performed less well on the task. As a first step to determine whether people in this study weighted their prediction errors relative to their precision, we used computational modeling. And what we did is we looked at models where people took the precision of prediction errors into account and models where they did not. And I don't have details that go really into this slide, but what I want to show you is that this model here, which is a very simple learning model, where you basically update your prediction as a function of the prediction error, independent of how variable the condition is, so how precise the condition is, but also independent of how many trials you had in the past. Whereas this model takes into account that after more trials you have become more certain, but also it weighs the prediction errors with the level of precision of the condition. So what we saw is that whereas healthy controls and people at risk of psychosis both were best fitted by a model where they took the precision of prediction errors into account, the people with first episode psychosis actually used the most simple learning model, but they did not take the uncertainty or precision into account. And this effect of a difference of precision weighting between the groups can also be observed if we look at a slightly more simple measure than the computational modeling itself, namely the learning rate. And the learning rate indicates how much of the prediction error you use to update your next prediction. And what you would expect is that if the precision is very high, your prediction error is trustworthy, so you should update your next prediction a lot, but you should do that much less when the precision of the prediction error is lower. So you would expect to see this pattern where people have a higher learning rate in high precision conditions compared to low precision conditions. And interestingly, whereas both the healthy controls and people at risk of psychosis showed this pattern of precision weighting in their behavior, the first episode psychosis group did not show this pattern, again suggesting that they did not precision weight for prediction errors. In the next step, we investigated whether we could also find an effect of precision weighting of prediction errors in the brain. And similar to the dopamine study, we looked at the right superior frontal cortex, and we looked at whether people would weigh prediction errors more if there was high precision compared to low precision, which you can see happens both in the healthy controls and in the people at risk for psychosis, but not in people at first episode psychosis, which again suggests that people with first episode psychosis did not precision weight their prediction errors. Finally, we were interested to see whether the findings of precision weighting in the brain had any relationship with symptoms. And we wanted to specifically look at positive symptoms, as positive symptoms have been mainly hypothesized to relate to precision weighting prediction errors. And what we found is when we combined both the first episode psychosis group and the people at risk for psychosis, we found a significant negative correlation between positive symptoms and precision weighting, meaning that the more precision weighting there was, the less likely people were to have high positive symptoms. So in the final step, we looked if the effects would remain after controlling for medication. So we found no difference in precision weighting in people with the first episode of psychosis who did take medication and those who did not. That we found the same thing when we combined that risk group and the first episode group. We also found no correlation between antipsychotic medication dose and the extent of precision weighting. And we found that both when we compared healthy controls to unmedicated and to medicated first episode patients, the results were significant, even though the p-values are slightly different. So we can conclude that it seemed that group differences were not at all driven by medication. So in summary, we found evidence that unsigned prediction errors are weighted relative to their precision in the superior frontal and dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. We also found that precision weighting of prediction errors was modulated by the dopaminergic antagonist sulpiride, and that the degree of precision weighting was correlated to task performance, suggesting that precision weighting is actually beneficial for learning. So combined, this finding provides evidence for the first time that dopamine plays a role in precision weighting of unsigned prediction error in the brain, and that this is beneficial for learning and performance. Our final conclusions relate to psychosis. So as a recap, psychosis has been theorized as a disorder of aberrant precision weighting, but yet there's little empirical data that has been provided in support of this claim. So first of all, we found that precision weighting was decreased in people with higher scores on the Discrete Type Personality Questionnaire. And more strong evidence for the relationship with psychosis came from the fact that people with first episode psychosis did not take into account the precision of prediction errors in their learning, and we could also not find a neural signature of precision weighting in first episode psychosis, whereas we could find these effects in the healthy control group and people at risk of psychosis. And very importantly, the difference that we found between people with psychosis and the healthy control group did not seem to be driven by medication, even though we found effects of a single dose of antipsychotic drug in the other study. So it seems that this is quite a robust signal, and therefore these findings implicate for the first time that precision weighting of prediction errors is a key mechanism that underlies the pathogenesis of psychotic symptoms and most likely of positive psychotic symptoms. I would like to finalize with acknowledging the many people that worked on this, but in particular to Joost Haarsma, who led this study, and to Graham Murray, with whom we together set up the study and carried out hypothesis analysis, etc. Would also like to thank all of our other co-authors and people who helped with separate aspects, such as the modeling or the scanning. And I would like to thank our funders. And finally, I would like to thank all of you for listening. If you would have any questions, then please feel free to send me an email and I will get back to you as soon as possible. So thank you for joining in for this talk, and I hope you enjoy the other talks in the symposium. Bye.
So hello to whoever's watching this online. Thank you to Franziska for putting together this symposium. My name is Teresa Katthagen. I'm a psychologist and a postdoc at the Charité in Berlin. We investigate the mechanisms of reinforcement learning in schizophrenia patients there. And in my talk today, I'm going to present some of our recent PET and fMRI data on aberrant salience, prediction errors, and dopamine synthesis capacity in schizophrenia patients. So let me start with some neurobiological background. What we see here is the dopamine synapse, and dopamine has been in the focus of schizophrenia research for a long time now. We know from clinical practice that antidopaminergic drugs reduce psychotic symptoms, and we can also measure the dopaminergic state directly with imaging techniques such as PET, and especially with f-dopa PET, that is a radiolabeled precursor of dopamine. One can measure how much dopamine is actually being synthesized in the presynapse. And with this technique, you get these pictures here, so a very strong signal in the striatum that is full of dopamine. And we know that from many meta-analysis now that this presynaptic dopamine synthesis capacity is increased in schizophrenia patients. And there are also studies that use the transdiagnostic approach, finding that this dopamine synthesis capacity wasn't only increased in patients with schizophrenia. For example, Sami Jara investigated schizophrenia patients and bipolar patients with psychosis and found a positive relationship between dopamine synthesis capacity and positive symptoms across this transdiagnostic patient group. And also in a more recent study by Cheng and colleagues, they found that patients with a delusional disorder also had higher levels in dopamine synthesis capacity. So the dopaminergic state might serve as a transdiagnostic biomarker of the psychotic state. But what we're still lacking here is a mediating mechanism that can explain how this too much of dopamine on the neurobiological side can relate to or can cause psychotic symptoms that we see, of course, on the levels of behavior and cognition. And one potential candidate for such a mechanism that has long been discussed is the reward prediction error. That's a computational signal that explains is made up of the difference between the outcome and the expectation that I had about this outcome. And it's a very crucial signal for learning and for forming associations. And there have been many studies now looking at that in schizophrenia, and mostly in studies that had investigated unmedicated schizophrenia patients. They found a decrease in that signal in the midbrain and in the striatum for this reward prediction error. So, but how can the signal be important for symptom formation? And this is very elegantly, I think, discussed in this framework by Maja and Frank that I have modified very much. It's way more complex when you look at the publication. But just for the sake of this talk, I think the great thing about this approach is that it formulates two pathways of how a heightened dopaminergic state in the striatum can cause positive symptoms, but also negative symptoms. And let me start with the left route here. This is basically the aberrant salience hypothesis of psychosis that has been around for almost 20 years now. So the idea is that too much striatal dopamine may cause these prediction error signals that I showed you before to appear chaotically, so not actually locked to something relevant going on at the same time in the environment. And we think that prediction errors on the psychological aspect are accompanied by the impression of something salient, meaningful, important must be going on. And then this aberrant salience impression must be attributed towards something to make sense of it all, so that actually coinciding and irrelevant events turn relevant to the individual then. And this is then explained away with a delusional scheme. So this is the route that probably many of you are familiar with. And interestingly, as I said, striatal dopamine may also cause negative symptoms by a decrease in the signal to noise ratio. So because we have these chaotic signals going on, those signals that are actually locked or appearing towards those events that are actually rewarding or important, that they don't stand out as much anymore. So the prediction errors to relevant events might be decreased because of that, because of too much dopamine. And then those actually relevant and rewarding events may be devalued and lose incentive, so that subjects don't approach such rewarding events anymore, decrease their motivation, and then negative symptoms increase. So this is a framework for it. And for the first part now of my talk, I'm going to focus on the left stream, so on this aberrant salience concept. And then for the next part, for the second part, I'm going to focus on reward prediction errors and negative symptoms. So as I explained, this concept of aberrant salience that is very much based on verbal reports of patients in the prodromal phase who say something important is going on, and I noticed things that I haven't noticed before. So from the clinical perspective, it's very convincing, this construct, but from the experimental perspective, it's very hard to actually measure this concept when anything can actually turn relevant. So, but I don't say we solved this issue, but we tried with the implicit salience paradigm that we based very much on the salience attribution test by Reusser and colleagues from London. And in this fMRI paradigm, subjects simply see a cue that is being followed by an outcome that can either be a rewarding coin or a neutral blue circle, and they simply have to perform target detection via button press. And what we kept from the SAT, of course, was that these cues vary in two dimensions. Here we have color and shape, and these dimensions are differently related to the outcome. So there's only one dimension at the time that is relevant for predicting the outcome, while the other one is completely irrelevant. And this is then crucial then for measuring aberrant salience responses. So I hope this gets more clear when I show you the ground truth contingencies. You can see the contingency for color to be rewarded in blue and shape to be rewarded in red. And in the beginning of or in the first half of the experiment, the shape is relevant because I can actually learn that triangles are reinforced more often than squares, and this reverses every 20 trials. And in the meantime, the color of the stimulus is completely irrelevant because both manifestations, gray cues and colorful cues, are reinforced at 50% of our trials. So, but if I do pay attention to that, and this is what we measure with the reaction time, so if something is salient, we think that this would make us respond faster and decrease our reaction time. So if I'm, for example, faster for gray than for colorful cues or vice versa, then this would be the first raw data measure of aberrant salience in our task. And we indeed find that this measure is increased, so more aberrant salience towards irrelevant events in our group of, I have to add, mostly chronic and medicated schizophrenia patients performing this task. And this is the raw data measure, but of course we were also interested in the learning process behind it going on, even though it was not essential to perform the task because it's just, that was just target detection. And we had some hints that subjects were actually learning that in their reaction time decrease following reversals. And we assumed that there was a learning process going on and used a computational model for that, and that was the hierarchical Gaussian filter. And we built a model that learned about shape and color in a parallel manner. But we thought, or we assumed, that the prediction errors would then drive the reaction times. So if there was a prediction error, I should become slower because I have to learn, okay, something has changed. I have to refocus my attention. And the idea is that only this prediction error coming from the dimension that is currently relevant, that this should affect my reaction times more strongly. So, and we needed a mathematical formalization of relevance in this model. And for that, we use the first level precision from the HGF. And this is based on the first level belief. And I think it's always easiest to start. You can see that in the figure at the belief of 0.5. This is basically 50-50. I don't know if the coin or the circle is coming in the next second. So it's very imprecise. And in this task, this would mean it's also irrelevant for the task. And the more my belief would deviate then from 0.5, this would increase the precision, increase the relevance. And we use that then to form this relevance weights that weighted the influence of the prediction errors of the respective dimension on reaction time. And we also had a computational measure for this bias towards one of the relevant manifestations. And in line with our raw data finding, we find that this bias, so this beta estimate here that we have in the response model, was increased in patients with schizophrenia. And let me come to the neural results here. We had very subtle, I have to say, activations within the salience network, so in the dorsal ACC and in the anterior insula, and also in the hippocampus for the relevance weighted signal that was free of the reward direction actually. And interestingly, this bias towards irrelevant events from this computational perspective correlated negatively with the striatal response towards relevant information, so to this relevance weighted prediction error signal. So patients that focus very strongly on this irrelevant information in the task showed less activation in the striatum to the actually important events going on. So let me try to integrate these findings now back into this framework. So we do find, at least in our measure, in our interpretation of aberrant salience, that this is increased in terms of raw data and also this computational measure in our patients with schizophrenia. But it gets a bit more complicated. We also see that both processes, so the focus on irrelevant information and the processing of relevant information, interfere. And of course, it's a correlation. We cannot make any claims about causality and the direction here. So maybe it's that, so let me just speculate. maybe it's because they're confused about everything going on and cannot learn anything about the relevant dimension, and then compensate by just holding on to just anything, and then this can be irrelevant, or it's the other way around, and my focus is too much on the irrelevant information, and then I cannot learn the actually important things going on. So, but we cannot dissociate this with our paradigm. And what I haven't shown you, another result is that we actually don't find this aberrant salience bias to be to be related to positive symptoms as we might have expected, but we do, however, find a positive relationship with negative symptoms. Again, here we can only speculate, but maybe it is that if I focus on the wrong information, I approach the wrong events, and that do not lead me where I thought they would lead me, and this would then also decrease motivation, increase negative symptoms. But again, that's just speculation, and further studies on this relationship are of course warranted. So this much about the aberrant salience route that led us already, even though rather surprisingly, to this decreased processing of relevant information. So now we did a study that looked at exactly that. And the main motivation actually was to see whether this proposed relationship of increased dopamine and decreased prediction error signals actually hold in patients and also in healthy controls. And for that, we used a multimodal design. So we had an fMRI part of the study where patients performed, and all subjects performed a reversal learning paradigm in the MRI scanner to get a clear prediction error signal. And we also had an FDOPA PET appointment where they, for us to get a signal for dopamine synthesis capacity. And in this study, the patients were actually unmedicated. So I will go on showing you the results of fMRI and PET separately first, and then let me come to the potential relationship afterwards. So, but first, just very quickly, this is a very classic reversal learning task. Subjects have to find out which one of the mutual cues is the rewarding one, and have to learn that by trial and error. And you see the contingencies here that are perfectly anti-correlated. Below as a stable phase in the beginning and in the end, and a volatile phase in the middle of the task. And we also use computational modeling here, but this time more standard models. So I'm not going to show you the equations here, but we used a very simple Wagner model space and found that the most simple models are the one with a single update, 1 alpha, and a normal softmax explained the data best. So, and then we use the prediction error there to look at the neural signals. And let me come to the results regarding this task. In line with the literature, we find that schizophrenia patients perform worse than healthy controls, so they have trouble picking the correct option in the task. And also in line, we find that in this group, we find a decreased signal in the ventral striatum of schizophrenia patients for the reward prediction error that, as I said, was based on the best fitting model. And this decrease in the signal here also related positively with negative symptoms. So those schizophrenia patients with a lower signal for the reward prediction error in the striatum had higher negative symptoms. So this time, or until here, very much in line with what we would have expected. But it gets more complicated now when we look at the PET results. So surprisingly, we didn't find any difference between groups in any of the striatal subregions. So values of KI values were very similar between both groups. So as I showed you in the beginning, but there are many meta-analyses now finding that, or reporting that this is a signal that is typically increased in schizophrenia patients. So we wanted yeah, at least for us, we were in need of a post-hoc explanation of why we didn't find that in our group of patients. And from now on, that's all now post-hoc, of course, because our study wasn't powered to now subdivide our groups or something like that. But we looked at the literature again, and we found this very interesting and for us very helpful study by Anissa Abidagan's group, who looked at dopamine release, not synthesis capacity, in patients with schizophrenia with a comorbid diagnosis of substance dependence. And interestingly, they find that these patients even had decreased levels in dopamine. And even though these levels were decreased, they were still correlated positively with their psychotic state. So we thought, okay, maybe this might be something that's also going on in our group, and looked at the characteristics of our patient sample. And we found that we had some subjects in there. So dependence, of course, was an exclusion criterion, but substance and alcohol abuse appeared in some patients as a comorbidity. So we subdivided our patient group into those with and without alcohol abuse, and indeed find that this affected the dopamine levels, or at least post-hoc seems to have affected that. And post-hoc in terms of explanations, I'm sorry. So we find that in yellow here, the group with alcohol abuse had, as in the Thompson study, decreased levels in dopamine, but here now in dopamine synthesis capacity. And those who didn't show this comorbid alcohol abuse, they showed this typical elevation of striatal dopamine in the associative part of the striatum. So, and then we looked at the correlation between symptoms and dopamine synthesis capacity, and now across all patients, because our groups are way too small then to look at that independently, and we still find, also in line with the Thompson study, that there was a positive relationship between dopamine levels and psychosis, even though we had patients in there that had clearly lower levels in dopamine compared, to those without, and without alcohol abuse. So this much about the separate PET and fMRI parts. Now let me come to the main question actually of this study, and that was whether there's an association between dopamine synthesis capacity and the prediction error. And interestingly, we find, yes, there's something, and it's different between patients and controls. So there is something, but only in controls, and this relationship is positive. So more dopamine synthesis capacity, a higher or stronger prediction error signal actually, and no such relationship in schizophrenia patients. So there was, of course, there were less patients who then actually had both parts of the study and went into PET and fMRI, but still in those 16 patients that were left, we didn't see a relationship between both signals there. So I think in order to understand that or to make sense of that, it's important to add that you have to keep in mind the subdivisions of the striatum that you're looking at. So what we're looking at right now is the limbic part of the striatum. We didn't find, or we only found the prediction error signal strongly in the limbic part of the striatum. So we also correlated that with the limbic dopamine synthesis capacity signal. But this isn't where, also only in our subgroup, where the signal was increased in schizophrenia. So, and also in a meta-analysis by McCutcheon and colleagues, they also found that in the associative and in the sensory motor part of the striatum, dopamine synthesis capacity is increased, but actually this is not where our decreased prediction error is found. So let me try to put this into the framework here. So yes, we do find that the prediction error is decreased to relevant events or to rewarding events in a study in schizophrenia patients that are unmedicated. I know that there are studies finding different things in medicated patients. And we also find that this is related to negative symptoms. And it's getting more complicated now looking at the neurobiology. Yeah, we do find in patients that do not have any comorbidity in terms of alcohol abuse, they have increased levels of striatal dopamine synthesis capacity. But there clearly seems to be some heterogeneity and confounds via the alcohol abuse status. But of course, this is a post hoc explanation that we were looking at, and our study wasn't really powered to look at this dissociation. So, yeah, future studies should definitely look at that with bigger sample sizes. And where it gets more complicated, even more complicated, is that we cannot find any indication for more dopamine causing less prediction error signaling. So in schizophrenia patients, we don't find any relationship, to repeat, but in the healthy control group, the relationship was actually positive. So there, more dopamine is actually something good, more prediction error signal. And this is also the same when we look at studies in healthy controls who report that an increased level in dopamine is related to higher cognitive functioning, just as working memory, for example. And of course, this might be due to an inverted U shape, that until you surpass a certain threshold in dopamine, it's still good to increase there, but if it's too much, then it breaks down. And but we cannot really say that for our sample that the decrease in prediction error was really due to an increase in striatal dopamine. So what leads me to the open question, what the increased levels of dopamine in the associative part of the striatum actually does, because this isn't where we find reward prediction errors to be located, and that are typically decreased in schizophrenia. So just guessing that maybe this is then the interesting one that affects everyone's saying that is, as it's been proposed in the hypothesis, that it's really something very noisy going on. But then if it's very noisy, it's also very hard to measure for us as experimenters. But yeah, lots of open questions to leave you with, and hopefully to be answered sometime. So with that, I want to close my talk. Of course, I want to thank all the patients that participated in the study, went into the fMRI and did all that. And thank you to my colleagues in Berlin, of course, to Florian Schlagenhauf, who's the PI of our group. And of course, we cannot really have this sort of discussion now because it's all online, but of course, feel free, if you have any questions or remark about this talk, to contact me via email. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to our symposium on learning and uncertainty in psychosis. My name is Franziska Knolle, and I'm a postdoctoral research associate at the Department of Neuroradiology at the Technical University Munich, and I will be talking about reinforcement learning in early stages of psychosis, and I will be showing you a multi-method approach combining imaging, behavioral and polygenic data. So here you can see a very brief outline of my talk. I will first be talking about reinforcement learning and its importance for psychosis, and then I'll be presenting two studies, a reward reinforcement learning study that has been conducted in an fMRI scanner, and then a behavioral study which has been conducted in two cohorts, so a patient cohort and a large sample. And then at the end, I will give you an overall summary. Okay, so what is reinforcement learning? This is a very brief introduction, and it's not aiming for completion at all. And I'm sorry for that very busy slide. I just want to point out the most important aspects, really. So maybe the easiest form of reinforcement learning is Pavlovian conditioning, so the combination or the association between a conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. So what we can see here is that a conditioned stimulus, a food reward, will lead to a specific response in a participant or an animal, as we can see here. So in this case, it will lead to the salivation of the dog. And then when this conditioned stimulus is paired with an unconditioned stimulus, so the occurrence of a bell, then after this association has been formed, the dog will also start salivating in response to the bell alone. And so basically what this example shows is a very simple form of trial and error learning, which basically is reinforcement learning. And reinforcement learning takes place over time. And the modulations to the associations are provided by prediction errors. So when there is a mismatch between what we expected and what is actually happening. And this is a really essential piece of information, because it allows our successful interaction with the environment, and also allows for some flexibility in the learning process. And then what has been shown by Wolfram Schultz already more than 2 decades ago is that dopamine neurons are highly important for signaling this reward prediction error. And what we can see here, that is a study conducted in monkeys, is that dopamine neurons start to fire in response to a reward, and this reward is basically a positive prediction error. So it hasn't been expected, and then it's suddenly happening. So dopamine neurons start to fire. And then when this reward is combined with the conditioned stimulus, dopamine neurons are basically silent in response to the reward, but they now start to fire in response to the conditioned stimulus. And that is and why they're silenced in response to the reward is basically because the reward is completely predictable. There is no surprise there anymore. However, still, the dopamine neurons are sensitive to the change, to potential change. So when the reward is not coming, we basically see a depression of the firing of the dopamine neurons, which here basically shows a negative prediction error. And then the panel to the right, what this one shows, it's taken from a study by Lee and colleagues from 2007, is that these dopamine firings are also sensitive to the reward value and its uncertainty. And then I've plotted here a graph from a study by Schoenberg and colleagues from 2007, simply to illustrate that there is a relation between the integration of the prediction error, or the strength of the prediction error, and how well people learn. So we can see a positive correlation between the strength of the response in the striatum and how good a person is learning over time. And now the question is, why is that important for psychosis? So basically, the idea is that an aberrant prediction error, so the encoding of a non-salient event as surprising, leads to the formation of positive symptoms, and the failure to build neural representations of the decision value may result in the negative symptoms. And here just very few examples, and there are many in the literature that show deficient or aberrant prediction error encoding in psychosis. And here to the left, you can see a study by Graham Murray and colleagues from 2008, and you can see that patients show reduced reduced encoding of the prediction error in the midbrain, and we see similar effects in the striatum and in the DLPFC as well here. And we also see a relation to positive symptoms. So here, the smaller the signal in the prefrontal cortex, the stronger the positive symptoms, and also here the smaller the signals in the stratum or the DRPFC, the stronger the negative symptoms. Here's shown with an example for distress. These studies that I'm presenting here have all been conducted in first episode psychosis patients and in chronic schizophrenia patients, and most of them have been medicated. So this is one of the confounding factors in this research. And so then what we basically try to do with our studies is the overall questions that we want to answer is, or that we want to address. I'm sure we can't, I know that we can't answer it fully in this with our studies at the moment. But what we try to tackle in this presentation here is whether reinforcement learning or deficits in reinforcement learning can be used as biological markers for psychosis. And specifically with the first study, we're looking at whether prediction errors are processed differently across the two stages, because that will be a prerequisite for a biological marker, and also whether learning from these prediction errors is impaired across the different stages. So here we're using, for the first study, a monetary probabilistic reward learning paradigm, which consists of 3 trial types, a reward trial type. So in 80% of the occurrences of the blue image, the participant will receive, if the participant selects this blue image, of course, then this will lead to a reward in 80%, and in 20% it will lead to a no change scenario, basically. So learning is well possible, but there's always a little bit of surprise in this setup. Then we have a bivalent trial type, in which basically the images are paired with a 50-50 chance to winning and losing £1. So learning in this scenario is not possible because of the 50-50 probabilistic chances. And then we have a neutral trial type, which is exactly like the reward trial, only that the outcome doesn't have any value. And again, then learning is not, we won't see any learning from these trials. The contrast that we are mainly interested in is the difference between winning £1 in the reward trial versus winning £1 in the bivalent trial. And this is because we can see here the difference between a low positive prediction error and high positive prediction error due to the different probabilities. We conducted this study in 2 patient groups, so first episode psychosis group and at-risk group. Both groups were unmedicated and antipsychotic naive, and a group of controls. And now I will be jumping right into the behavioral results. So what we can see here is the percentage correct of the choices made on the 3 trial types. And what we can see is that learning, as I pointed out, is not possible in the bivalent trials and the neutral trials, so they're on 50-50 chance, and there's no differences between the groups. And then what we can see here is that for the reward trials, controls perform slightly better than the 2 patient groups, but this difference is actually not significant. Okay, so because we didn't find these very clear behavioral results for the percentage correct, we tried to dig a little bit deeper and looked at the win, stay, lose, shift behavior. And what we found here is that we actually do find differences in how people integrate the information from the prediction error. So controls here presented in red have a higher probability to stay on the same choice when they won on the same choice, and they also are less likely to change their decision after losing on a reward trial. And we can see that this is not the case for the first episode psychosis group. They're much more variable in their choices, and it seems that they are a little bit more random in how they generate their decisions. Also, what we can see here is that there is no difference between or no significant difference between the at-risk group, but it seems to be moving into a kind of intermediate position between the two. Okay, and now looking at the imaging results. What I'm presenting here on the left is a display of the group differences across the three groups. We conducted a region of interest analysis, combining the DLPFC bilaterally, the midbrain and the striatum in one mask, basically. And then what we found is significant differences in the DLPFC and in the midbrain. And then simply for illustration effects, I plotted here on the right the contrast of the parameter estimates for the prediction error signal. And what we can see for the midbrain is this very nicely pronounced effect in the controls, and we see a strong decrease of this effect in the first episode psychosis group, and we see a sort of intermediate stage of the at-risk group, and this is all significantly different. And this is an interesting finding because it really shows the kind of continuous progression of the disease. It, however, looks very different for the DLPFC. Here we see a maintained response in the at-risk group, and this is I find that really interesting and really intriguing, because of course we can of course argue that there is effect, but there is a compensatory effect, for the deficiency in the subcortical structures. But one speculation could also be that those people those individuals who already show an intermediate response at the at-risk stage are then those who might progress into a first episode. So one finding that supports that at least a little bit is that we found this nice correlation between the midbrain activation and the DLPFC activation. So here we can speculate that the DLPFC is potentially a candidate for investigating that progression and functioning as one of the markers for psychosis. Okay, and now I'm moving on to the second study. Here we're trying to dig a little bit more in the underlying learning mechanisms that are deficient when it comes to reinforcement learning. As from our first study, we found really interesting imaging results, but the behavioral findings were not too clear at that point. So using a modeling approach, we try to investigate that a little bit more in detail, and then in the later part, we will try to use these specific parameters of reinforcement learning to link them to schizotypy and to the molecular risk of schizophrenia. Okay, this is a presentation of the second paradigm. It's a adapted version of the go-no-go task, and in this go-no-go task we basically combine two aspects, so action and valence. So we have action inhibition on this side and action invigoration on this side, and then also a combination of reward and punishment. And this leads to the possibility to investigate Pavlovian congruent scenarios and Pavlovian incongruent scenarios. So what we can see is that it is, or what we know from the literature is that it is easier to respond to a Pavlovian congruent situation. So for us, it is easier to perform an action in response to a reward and to withhold an action to avoid a punishment. And here you can see a display between the images that we used and the actual outcomes. And again, these images occurred randomly, and so it really fulfilled the trial and error learning pattern again of reinforcement learning. And this paradigm was used in basically two cohorts, in a patient cohort that overlapped with the patient cohort of the first study that I presented, only that in this study we combined medicated and non-medicated individuals. And then we also used this paradigm in a large cohort that included healthy individuals from the NSPN 2400 cohort, and for 300 of those participants we had polygenic risk scores for schizophrenia. In terms of symptom scores for the large cohort, we used the SPQ, so the schizotypal personality questionnaire, to assess their psychotic symptoms on a spectrum, basically. Okay, so this is just a very general display of the performance in this task. So what we can see, basically, this is a display for the patient study, and what we can see is that what I pointed out in my introduction, that it is easier to perform a Pavlovian congruent condition. So we see that the overall performance is better in the go to win and the no go to avoid losing compared to the other two, compared to the Pavlovian incongruent condition. And we see that this pattern is true for all three groups. So it's maintained across the patient groups. Also, I would like to point out that the large cohort is performing exactly like the controls in this patient study. So I will only display the patient study here. What we also see is that there is slight differences between the groups within each condition, and overall we can basically see that the controls are performing better than the first episode psychosis group. And now we wanted to understand the underlying mechanisms a little bit better that lead to this performance difference, and there we used a hierarchical Bayesian modeling approach, and we used the available HBase DM package provided by Anne and colleagues, which is a very nice package because it includes different models and conducts a model comparison, and the model that had the best model fit for our study was the one that combined the most parameters. So it included lapse rate, learning rate, go bias, Pavlovian bias, sensitivity to reward, and sensitivity to punishment. And that was very interesting and very, very good for us because we were especially interested in the Pavlovian bias and sensitivity to reward and punishment. So what we can see here is that we do find differences between the groups, and that the differences are sensitive to the onset of these. So the most differences we find are the differences between the controls and the first episode psychosis group. There is a few surprising effects. So we found that the learning rate was not different between the controls and the first episode psychosis group, although the mean, you can see that the mean is higher between the controls and the first episode psychosis group, the variance is just a lot wider than in the patients. But we do see that the learning rate of the at-risk group is higher than the first episode psychosis group. Also, what we can see is that that the controls and the at-risk group have a stronger go bias, which is a very nice finding, because this is often linked to negative symptoms and is linked to the inability to initiate an action in the patient. And then we see that the patients, the first episode psychosis patients, have a stronger Pavlovian bias, which here could indicate the inflexibility in in learning from this more complex pattern of behaviors. And this is also apparent that we find a stronger sensitivity to reward and punishment. So, which basically means that the controls are more sensitive to integrating the feedback into their choice generation. Interestingly, here we do see differences between the two patient groups, and this is potentially interesting for future research to investigate that a bit more closely and potentially detect that as a marker for, again, as a marker to investigate the transition from the risk state to the first episode state. Then we investigated these parameters in relation to symptoms, and we found that in the arms group, we found a positive correlation between the negative PUNS and the learning rate, and in the first episode psychosis patient, a negative correlation between the positive PUNS and the learning rate. And in the large cohort, interestingly, we did not find any significance or any significant correlations between any of the modeling parameters and the symptom scores assessed with the SPQ. That was surprising. That was really surprising, and it gives a first indication that we're looking at a very healthy sample with a very small distribution in pathological parameters. And then we used the PRS scores and conducted several multiple regression analyses between the PRS scores and the parameters. We were especially interested in the learning parameter, as this showed the most reliable differences between the groups and also the links to the different sets of symptoms. However, we did not find any significant results, and that was really unfortunate. But again, as I already pointed out, in the relation to the symptom correlations, potentially we're really looking at a very healthy cohort, and this becomes also apparent when looking at the distribution of the data points. So they're really very closely gathered around 0. And another very important aspect is that we're only looking at 300 data points, which is a very small sample in a genetic framework. So with this, we can't conclusively make a statement about the importance of the genetic data or the link between the PRS and the modeling parameters. We really do need a bigger sample with more variation, but for our study we didn't find any interactions. And with that, I would like to summarize. So we found evidence for dysfunctional predictive reward processing in the dopaminergic midbrain, but not in the DLPFC. And this is very interesting because here we found that potentially the DLPFC provides one of the markers for markers of reinforcement learning and prediction error processing and the detection of psychosis. Then we found that the specific reinforcement learning deficits are sensitive to illness onset. We also found links to the positive and negative symptoms, but we did not find that the PRS would significantly predict the reinforcement learning parameters. So as I already pointed out on the slide before, is that unfortunately our combination of studies and also the results from our studies did not provide a definite answer to the question of whether deficits in reinforcement learning could be used as a biological marker. However, we were able to add some more information to the existing literature, and some of those aspects are looking very promising for the detection of a biological marker. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for listening, and especially my former supervisor, Graham Murray, and all the other collaborators on this work. Thank you very much.